Some people think they're lazy, others believe they just lost motivation, and many blame themselves for not having the same energy they used to have. But what if the truth is something much deeper? What if the reason you feel constantly tired, even when nothing physically demanding happened, is because your mind has been fighting silent battles for years? There is a type of exhaustion that sleep does not fix, a fatigue that no vacation solves, a weight that builds quietly inside a person until one day they wake up feeling like something inside them has shut down. And the strange part is this: from the outside, everything can look normal. You still go to work, you answer messages, you smile when people expect you to smile. But inside, something feels different. The energy that once made simple things feel meaningful has slowly disappeared. Small tasks feel overwhelming, conversations feel draining. Even things you used to enjoy sometimes feel like obligations. And you start asking yourself a question that almost nobody knows how to answer. What happened to me? Because the truth is, most people don't realize when emotional exhaustion begins. It doesn't arrive suddenly. It grows quietly, day after day, responsibility after responsibility, emotion after emotion, until one day the mind simply stops feeling the way it used to. And if you've ever felt this kind of deep tiredness, there's a hidden reason behind it that almost nobody talks about, and understanding it might completely change the way you see yourself. At first, you assume it's just fatigue. Maybe you slept badly. Maybe work has been stressful. Maybe you simply need a few days off. So you try to rest. You sleep longer on the weekend. You scroll through your phone trying to relax. You take a break, hoping your energy will return. But something strange happens. The tiredness stays, not just in your body, but somewhere deeper. You wake up after 8 hours of sleep and still feel drained. Simple decisions suddenly feel heavy. Even small responsibilities start to feel overwhelming. And that's when a quiet doubt begins to appear in your mind. Why am I like this? People around you might not notice anything unusual. From their perspective, your life looks normal. You're still functioning, still showing up, still doing what you're supposed to do. But internally, it feels like you're moving through life with an invisible weight attached to you. A weight that makes everything require more effort than it should. And the most confusing part is this: you can't clearly explain where the exhaustion is coming from, because it isn't physical, it's emotional. The kind of exhaustion that forms when a person spends years carrying responsibilities, expectations, worries, and silent struggles without ever truly releasing them. But here is the question most people never stop to ask. What happens inside the human mind when emotional pressure quietly accumulates for years without relief? Because there is a hidden psychological mechanism behind this exhaustion, and once you understand it, you may realize that the tiredness you've been blaming on laziness was actually your mind trying to survive something much heavier. To understand emotional exhaustion, you have to understand something most people never notice. The human mind is not designed to carry unresolved emotions indefinitely. Every worry you suppress, every frustration you swallow, every moment you force yourself to stay strong when you are actually overwhelmed, your brain records it, not as a memory, but as emotional weight. Psychologists sometimes call this the silent emotional load. It's the invisible accumulation of stress responses that never fully complete their cycle. Your nervous system prepares to react, but the reaction never happens. You don't scream, you don't cry, you don't collapse. You just keep going. And at first, that ability feels like strength. You become the reliable person, the one who solves problems, the one who holds everything together. But inside the brain, something very different is happening. Your nervous system remains partially activated for long periods of time. Stress hormones rise, but never fully settle. The mind stays alert, even when there is no immediate danger. And slowly, over months and years, this constant internal tension begins to drain your emotional energy. Not dramatically, quietly, almost invisibly, until one day you notice something unsettling. You don't feel the same way about things anymore. Excitement fades faster. Motivation becomes harder to find. Even happiness sometimes feels muted. And this is where many people make a painful mistake. They assume something is wrong with their personality, but the truth is much deeper than that. Because when emotional pressure remains unresolved long enough, the brain begins to shift into a completely different mode of functioning. When emotional exhaustion lasts long enough, the brain begins to adapt in ways most people never realize. Your mind is built for survival. Its primary goal is not happiness, it is protection. And when the brain detects prolonged emotional pressure, it slowly shifts into a protective mode designed to conserve energy. At first, the changes are subtle. Your attention becomes more selective. Your motivation begins to fluctuate. Your tolerance for stress becomes lower than it used to be. But underneath these experiences, a deeper neurological process is unfolding. Regions of the brain responsible for threat detection become more active. Your nervous system starts scanning for potential problems more often than before, even when nothing is visibly wrong. At the same time, the parts of the brain connected to reward and pleasure begin to quiet down. Activities that once created excitement now produce a weaker emotional response, not because you stopped caring, but because your brain is trying to reduce emotional expenditure. In simple terms, your mind begins operating in a low-energy survival state. And this state changes the way life feels. Decisions take more effort. Social interaction feels heavier. Your thoughts move slower. Sometimes people describe this experience as feeling mentally foggy. Others say it feels like their emotional battery never fully charges anymore. And what makes this process so confusing is that from the outside, nothing dramatic seems to be happening. But internally, your brain has been running a long psychological marathon without ever reaching the finish line. And when that happens, the mind begins to search for ways to protect itself from further emotional overload. One of the most dangerous things about emotional exhaustion is that it rarely looks dramatic. It doesn't always appear as a breakdown. Most of the time, it looks like a personality change. You become quieter than before, less enthusiastic about things you once loved, more withdrawn in conversations. You stop explaining how you feel because describing the exhaustion itself feels exhausting. And slowly, the people around you begin to form a new image of who you are. They might say you became more serious, more distant, more reserved. But what they don't see is the emotional process happening underneath. Your mind is trying to survive. When emotional energy becomes scarce, the brain begins to reduce how much of it gets spent. You talk less, you react less, you feel less. Not because you chose to change, but because your system is conserving resources. And over time, this survival response starts shaping behavior patterns. You cancel plans more often. You avoid unnecessary conflict. You choose silence instead of explaining yourself. Little by little, exhaustion starts defining your identity. You begin to think, maybe this is just who I am now. But emotional exhaustion doesn't only change behavior, it changes perception. Life starts to feel heavier than it used to. Even hope sometimes feels distant. And that is exactly the moment when many people begin to believe a painful lie. They believe they have become weak, when in reality, something very different has been happening inside their mind all along. But here is something almost nobody talks about. There is a specific type of emotional exhaustion that is extremely difficult to recognize while it is happening, because it doesn't feel like burnout at first. It feels like responsibility. It feels like being strong. It feels like being the person who holds everything together when others fall apart. Many people who are emotionally exhausted are actually the ones everyone else relies on. They are the listeners, the problem solvers, the ones who stay calm during chaos. And because of that role, they rarely allow themselves to stop. They keep pushing through difficult moments. They keep absorbing stress that was never meant for them to carry alone. And little by little, something dangerous begins to happen. The brain adapts to constant pressure. Stress stops feeling temporary. It becomes normal. And once emotional overload becomes normal, the mind stops sending clear warning signals. Instead of panic, you feel numbness. Instead of collapse, you feel quiet fatigue. Instead of asking for help, you convince yourself you just need to be stronger. But there is a type of emotional tiredness that almost nobody recognizes, and it might be controlling the way you live right now. Because when the mind spends years in survival mode, it starts building habits designed only for endurance, not for peace. And the longer someone stays in that state, the harder it becomes to remember what emotional rest even feels like, which raises a question that most people have never seriously considered. What happens to a person when surviving emotionally becomes their default way of living?
After long periods of emotional pressure, something unusual begins to happen inside the mind. You don't just feel tired, you begin to feel less excited, less reactive, less emotionally present. Many people describe this experience as numbness, not sadness, not depression, just a strange emotional distance from everything around them. Moments that should feel meaningful pass by without creating the same emotional response they once did. Good news feels quieter, bad news feels strangely muted. Even joy sometimes feels like it's happening behind a glass wall. And this confuses people deeply, because they start asking themselves a frightening question. Why don't I feel the way I used to? But emotional numbness is not a failure of the heart. It's a protective response from the brain. When the nervous system experiences continuous emotional strain, it begins to regulate how much feeling it allows to surface. Too much emotion requires energy, and energy is exactly what the exhausted mind is trying to conserve. So the brain quietly lowers emotional intensity across the board. Not only the painful emotions, but the positive ones too. It's similar to dimming the lights in a room to save electricity. Everything is still there, but nothing shines as brightly. This is why emotional exhaustion can feel so confusing. You are still functioning, still living, still moving through your daily responsibilities. But inside, it can feel like the emotional color of life has slowly faded. And when someone lives long enough in that state, they may begin to wonder if the person they used to be is gone forever. A few years ago, a therapist shared a story about a woman named Laura. From the outside, Laura seemed like someone who had everything under control. She had a stable job, she supported her family, she was the friend people called when they needed advice. Everyone described her the same way: strong, reliable, the one who always handles everything. And for years, that description felt accurate. Laura rarely complained. When problems appeared, she solved them. When someone needed emotional support, she was there. But something slowly started changing. At first, it was small things. She noticed that getting out of bed required more effort than before. Conversations that once felt natural now drained her energy. Even simple decisions began to feel mentally heavy. Still, she kept going, because nothing in her life looked dramatic enough to justify stopping. Until one afternoon, during a routine conversation, she said something that surprised even herself. She told the therapist, "I'm not sad. I'm not even overwhelmed. I just feel empty." That sentence stayed in the therapist's mind, because Laura's experience is far more common than most people realize. Emotional exhaustion rarely announces itself loudly. Most of the time, it quietly replaces a person's inner world with a strange sense of distance. And the most confusing part is this: many people living this experience still appear perfectly functional from the outside, which makes them believe they are the only ones feeling this way.
Stories like Laura's reveal something important about emotional exhaustion. The most dangerous stage isn't when someone breaks down, it's when they keep functioning, when they continue working, continue helping others, continue appearing stable. Because when a person is still capable of performing their responsibilities, the world assumes everything is fine. And eventually, the person starts believing that too. They tell themselves things like, maybe I'm just tired, maybe everyone feels like this, maybe I'm overthinking. But deep inside, a quiet signal keeps repeating, something doesn't feel right. The energy that once came naturally now requires effort. The emotional spark that once made life feel alive now appears only occasionally. And the person begins adapting to this new internal state. They lower their expectations. They simplify their routines. they stop chasing things that once mattered. Not because they stopped caring, but because their emotional capacity has been quietly reduced. And this is the moment where many people unknowingly cross a psychological threshold. Because there is a stage of emotional exhaustion where the mind stops trying to recover and starts learning how to operate while permanently tired. But here is the part almost nobody realizes. When emotional survival becomes your normal way of living, your brain slowly forgets what emotional safety feels like. And that hidden shift can change the way a person sees themselves for years.
When emotional exhaustion lasts for years, the mind eventually makes a quiet decision. If recovery doesn't seem possible, survival becomes the strategy. This is what psychologists often describe as emotional survival mode. It's not a dramatic state. There are no alarms, no clear moment when everything changes. Instead, the shift happens slowly. Your mind begins organizing life around one simple goal: avoid additional emotional strain. You start protecting your limited energy without even realizing it. You decline invitations that once sounded exciting. You postpone conversations that feel emotionally demanding. You choose routines that require less mental effort. From the outside, these choices can look like withdrawal. But internally, they are acts of preservation. Your brain is trying to prevent complete burnout. So it reduces risks, reduces emotional exposure, reduces anything that might create additional pressure. And over time, something subtle begins to happen. Life becomes smaller. Not because you want less from life, but because your mind is trying to protect what little emotional energy remains. Dreams that once felt possible start to feel distant. Curiosity becomes quieter. Even hope sometimes feels fragile. But here is the truth that almost nobody tells people in this state. The problem is not that you became weak. The problem is that your mind has been running in survival mode for far too long. And when a brain stays in survival mode long enough, it starts to believe that survival is the only way life can exist.
There is a painful misunderstanding that follows many people who live with emotional exhaustion. They believe something is wrong with them. They think they became weaker than they used to be, less motivated, less capable, less resilient. But the truth is almost the opposite. Many emotionally exhausted people are not weak at all. They are people who stayed strong for far too long. They are the ones who carried responsibilities without asking for help, the ones who absorbed stress so others wouldn't have to, the ones who kept moving forward even when their inner world was slowly running out of energy. And because they learned to endure so much, they became experts at hiding their own emotional fatigue. They smile when they feel drained. They reassure others while feeling uncertain inside. They keep performing stability even when their mind is asking for rest. Over time, this constant endurance creates a silent contradiction. From the outside, they look strong, but internally, they feel depleted. And eventually, a painful belief begins to form. If I feel this tired, maybe something inside me is broken. But emotional exhaustion is not evidence of weakness. It is often evidence of prolonged strength. Strength used without enough recovery. Strength used in environments that demanded too much for too long. Strength used in silence. And when someone carries that kind of invisible load for years, the mind doesn't collapse because it is fragile. It collapses because it has been fighting alone for far too long.
At some point, many emotionally exhausted people reach a quiet but terrifying conclusion. They begin to believe they have lost something essential about themselves: their passion, their energy, their sense of aliveness. They look at who they used to be and wonder where that version of them disappeared. But the truth is far more compassionate than most people imagine. You did not suddenly lose your strength. You did not become lazy, and you did not lose your ability to feel deeply. What happened is something much more human. Your mind has been protecting you. When emotional pressure continues for too long, the brain begins reducing how much energy it allows you to spend on the world. Not because you are incapable, but because your system is trying to keep you from completely collapsing. And that leads to a truth that many people have never heard before.
Some people think they are just tired, but the truth is, they have been emotionally exhausted for years, not from one dramatic event, but from thousands of small moments where they had to stay strong when what they really needed was rest. Thousands of days where they kept going because stopping did not feel like an option. And here is the question that changes everything. If emotional exhaustion is not weakness, then why does it slowly start to feel like it has become part of who you are?
What if the exhaustion you feel is not a sign that something inside you is broken? What if it is evidence of something else entirely? For years, you may have interpreted your emotional fatigue as failure. Failure to stay motivated, failure to keep the same energy, failure to be the person you once were. But emotional exhaustion tells a very different story. It tells the story of a mind that kept going long after it should have been allowed to rest. A mind that carried responsibilities, worries, expectations, and emotional weight without ever receiving enough recovery. Imagine asking a runner to sprint every single day without stopping. Eventually, their body would slow down, not because the runner lost strength, but because the body is protecting itself from permanent damage. Your mind works the same way. When emotional effort continues for too long, the brain reduces activity to preserve what remains. It is not failure. It is protection. It is the nervous system trying to survive overwhelming demand, which means something important. The exhaustion you feel today may not represent who you have become. It may represent how long you have been fighting without realizing it. And once a person begins to see their exhaustion through this lens, something powerful begins to shift, because they stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking a much more honest question. What have I been carrying for far too long? There is something important most people never hear when they are emotionally exhausted. Recovery rarely begins with sudden motivation. It begins with understanding. The moment someone realizes their exhaustion is not a personal failure, something inside them softens. The constant self-criticism begins to loosen. The voice that kept repeating, "You should be stronger," slowly becomes quieter. And that small shift creates space for something the exhausted mind has been missing for a very long time: compassion. Not from others, from yourself. Because the truth is, many emotionally exhausted people have spent years being kind, patient, and understanding with everyone around them, except themselves. They forgive others, they support others, they comfort others. But when it comes to their own exhaustion, they respond with judgment. And that judgment keeps the nervous system trapped in pressure. But here is something surprising. The brain begins recovering the moment emotional pressure decreases. Even small changes matter. A moment of honesty about how tired you really feel, a boundary you were afraid to set, a decision to stop carrying something that was never yours to carry alone. And this leads to something most people don't realize. Emotional exhaustion does not mean your inner world is permanently damaged. It often means your mind has been protecting you for longer than it should have had to. And once protection is no longer the only priority, something inside the mind slowly begins to wake up again. If you've been feeling emotionally exhausted for a long time, there is something you deserve to hear. Your mind was never meant to carry everything alone. Humans are not designed to endure endless emotional pressure without rest, support, or relief. But many people try. They keep showing up. They keep solving problems. They keep being strong because life never seems to pause long enough for them to finally breathe. And after years of doing that, something inside them begins to slow down. Not because they are weak, but because their mind has been protecting them from breaking completely. So if you've watched this video and recognized yourself in these experiences, maybe the real question is not why you feel this tired. Maybe the real question is how long you have been carrying things that were never meant for you to carry alone. Because emotional exhaustion is rarely the result of a single moment. It is the result of being strong every day, without the space to rest, without the permission to feel, without the support that every human mind needs. And sometimes the most healing realization is this: maybe you're not broken. Maybe you've just been strong for too long. So if something in this video explained a part of your life, tell me honestly in the comments. When was the last time you truly felt at peace?